Over the last 15 years or so, cities around the world have invested a lot of money in revitalizing urban downtowns, formerly industrialized areas, and especially in greening those areas. That is, in bringing nature back into the city, in improving the quality of life of residents by creating new parks, new gardens, new greenways, by cleaning up rivers as well, by rebuilding waterfronts. And a lot of this has been associated with green branding. That is the way in which a city can also change its image, attract new attention, investment, residents through the improved quality of life it creates for residents and through the benefits that those green spaces and nature in the city brings to residents. What we see, however, is that the universal effects of greening are not exactly like this on the ground. A lot of historic inequalities in access to green space have not been well addressed, and at the same time, many green projects have contributed to increased speculation, and in the end, the displacement of working class and historically marginalized groups. This is what we call green gentrification, that is, the unequal benefits to green space that urban redevelopment creates, depending on the race, ethnicity, or gender, for example, that you belong to. Barcelona is one of the cities that has put a lot of attention over the last 15 years in greening its infrastructure, its roads, and its public spaces. And it's also a city that has lived through an economic growth due to tourism, due to international investments and visitors. So we've always seen a contrast, or we've always seen a tension between improving the quality of life for residents and at the same time, that quality of life benefits being captured by tourists, by investors, and by visitors, rather than really being a form of asset that residents could benefit from.
One of the most critical neighborhoods is that of Poblenou, a post-industrial neighborhood that has seen massive transformation since 1992 with the Olympic Games that were held in Barcelona. Poblenou is already part of an ongoing project, the 22@, 22@, which is a massive urban transformation project that aims to create a so-called innovation district, and which has already caused massive trends of gentrification in the neighborhood. And the neighbors are very well aware of the impacts of this project, and they're fighting against it.
El pla del 22@ es va aprovar l'any 2000 i era un pla que bàsicament el que feia era enderrocar gran part del nostre barri, del Poblenou, per construir un barri d'oficines i hotels. En principi havia de ser per una nova tecnologia i un nou model econòmic, que en principi va beneficiar molt més al barri i a la ciutat, però hem vist que a la vegada té uns efectes bastant perversos sobre el territori. Per una banda, també es va destruir una gran part dels oficis tradicionals i tot un ecosistema de petits tallers que també produïen productes que eren necessaris per la ciutat, però alhora també la nova economia que ha portat tampoc no és beneficiosa per tothom. De fet, un dels usos que més s'ha instal·lat al 22@ són precisament els call centers, és a dir, grans plantes amb cubicles i oficines que el que fan és atendre trucades. També els hotels amb feines bastant precaritzades de neteja i de cures. Per tant, realment la feina que ens venen del valor afegit i del talent és realment una feina per molt pocs.
In Poblenou, one of the most debated projects, part of this plan of 22@, is the so-called superillas, the super block of Poblenou. This is a plan that basically closes off 9 city blocks to cars and opens up space for pedestrians, cyclists, public transportation, and new play and green areas. The main question here is whether this new project of the Poblenou superilla will cause green gentrification in the area or not.
Hi ha altres zones del barri en el que també s'estan fent operacions d'aquest tipus de noves zones verdes que, encara que tenen un efecte molt positiu i que creiem que són necessàries, tenen a la vegada un efecte en els valors del preu del sòl i que alhora també poden provocar una certa gentrificació. És el cas que va passar amb el Parc Central, en el qual es va arrasar uns passatges i unes cases baixes de gent que vivia allà per substituir-lo per nous habitatges i oficines i hotels. És també el cas de les Glòries i també el cas de Cristóbal de Moura, que és un nou eix verd que s'està fent que connecti Poblenou amb el barri del Besòs, però que alhora creua totes les zones del 22@. Són aquestes zones que en aquests anys, amb l'anunci que es faria aquest eix verd, s'han revaloritzat. I ens hem trobat amb casos del que diuen habitatge habitatge no convencional, que el que significa són lofts. I hem vist pisos com són els del Passatge del Sucre, pisos que guanyen premis del disseny, però que alhora valen doncs, molts milions d'euros. De fet, hi ha un per 4 milions d'euros, però clar, per aquí estem fent un barri amb pisos de 1.000 metres quadrats per 4 milions d'euros. És a dir, està clar que no és pels veïns del barri o per gent de classe treballadora.
Another similar case of redevelopment and displacement, also in Poblenou, is that of Passatge de Morenas. Passatge de Morenas is a short alley on the north end of the neighborhood, which has a group of low-rise houses that were built back in the 1930s and which were planned to be demolished and substituted by a high-rise 12-story office building.
En esta manzana, por ejemplo, una empresa ha comprado un 62%. No mira nada, ellos nada más que quieren edificar, edificar y edificar. Y esta manzana pues va toda afuera, toda. Esto yo me enteré porque tengo un amigo que es propietario. Entonces un día estaba en el bar que tenemos ahí en la esquina, que es de toda la vida, el bar Siberia, y vio unos señores con traje en la esquina del pasaje. Bajaron de una furgoneta, empezaron a mirar, echar fotos. Entonces eso a él le dio que pensar. Entonces miró a ver si había alguna información, entonces encontró unas páginas que venía todo el proyecto que querían hacer aquí, todo, 161 páginas de lo que van a hacer aquí en la manzana. Entonces me lo comunicó, dijo, oye Manuela, ¿sabes qué pasa esto? Digo, no. Digo, ¿qué me estás contando? ¿No? Me quedé un poco hasta sorprendida. Entonces se lo comuniqué a los vecinos de enfrente, a los vecinos de aquí, porque muchos no sabían absolutamente nada. Entonces hicimos una reunión y lo que logramos fue que se quedara la situación un poco parada y de momento que los que vivimos en las casitas, pues que nos dejen. Pero a la larga sí que nos iremos de aquí. Bueno, nos echará, que es diferente.
What we know now is that these houses in the end are not going to be demolished. The municipality decided to reconsider their decision. And in fact, these houses are now protected. And this shows the relevance of these kinds of neighborhood struggles for defining the future of the neighborhood and preserving a local identity.
Since the mid-1990s, Nantes has hugely invested in the greening of the city. It's now a city that has more than 100 gardens and parks, hundreds of kilometers of blue spaces and green spaces along the Loire River, and it's actually even become a city in the garden. It's the image that it has projected for itself. That has also been possible thanks to the way in which arts allows also residents to benefit from green spaces and vice versa. One of the places where that relationship is most visible is the Jardin des Plantes, which is like a green architecture spaces. It's like the spectacle of the green that Nantes every year changes, improves, and that welcomes millions of visitors every year. It also has associated projects such as the Jardin Extraordinaire, the extraordinary garden, where one can really see the association between design, art, biodiversity, and greening. Nantes has not always been green. Up to the 1990s, it was a shipyard industry-based economy. It had huge amount of industrial land on the Ile de Nantes. It was a gray city. And interestingly enough, many of the Nantes neighborhoods are still working class. Chantenay is one of them, even the Ile de Nantes. And the city has created now a whole array of projects that are meant to revitalize and redevelop those neighborhoods into eco-districts or eco-innovation. The question here, however, is for whom those new green and livable post-industrial neighborhoods are for. And actually, not all residents are buying into this branding that combines green, art, culture, and quality of life, because they don't necessarily see that they can benefit from it over the long term. What we've seen over the years are citizen collectives, citizen groups growing to try to propose an alternative vision to the one of the official green city, more built on the working class past, and also on informal green spaces that residents have visited, created, or used.
Notre projet, c'est un peu de court-circuiter toute la propagande municipale. Donc, en fait, on a fait beaucoup, quand on pouvait encore, des balades dans la carrière, dans la friche. On a fait un livre qui s'appelle « Carrière, misérie, destruction d'une ville sauvage ». Bon, c'est des petites gouttes d'eau, mais qui peu à peu, quand même, font prendre conscience que cette ville, est-ce qu'elle est si verte que ça ? Est-ce qu'elle est si attractive que ça? Et est-ce qu'elle est attractive pour qui? Pour des gens qui ont de l'argent? Qu'est-ce qu'on fait de tous les gens des quartiers? En fait, on veut une ville un peu aseptisée, où c'est bien vert. Mais par contre, on délaisse complètement le quartier du Bas-Chantenay, qui va peu à peu disparaître pour un quartier propre et gentrifié et touristifié.
Another example in Nantes is the collective du Bois-Hardy, which is a group of residents from the more industrial working class part of Chantenay, which is claiming another model of redevelopment for the area away from a mass construction of new housing and one that respects the informal gardens that people has had for decades.
On est une cinquantaine de jardiniers et il y a à peu près 300 ou 350 personnes qui suivent l'ensemble des activités sur la zone. On travaille beaucoup avec les écoles du quartier pour aussi faire connaître le lieu aux enfants et donc aux parents du quartier. Au-delà des aspects alimentaires, biodiversité, c'est aussi un lieu de convivialité. Donc on fait beaucoup de moments un peu festifs et notamment des événements culturels. À minuit, on arrête tout. Alors pour respect pour les voisins, mais aussi pour que la faune sauvage reprenne un peu ses droits, notamment les chauves-souris et les rapaces nocturnes.
It's clear that Nantes has put a lot of emphasis on green space, size, quality, access for all residents. However, the way in which the branding, the way in which the revitalization of neighborhoods has been conducted has raised the attentions of some neighborhood collectives who want to preserve a more neighborhood-based use of spaces rather than, let's say, the extraordinary green that Nantes has achieved.
Montreal is a city that has really undergone a dramatic economic transformation in the past 30 years. Since the late 2000s, there's been a big influx of creative industries and so-called creative classes. And this has really transformed the housing in the city for more private new build housing that are called condos, as well as kind of the foodscape, so the types of food offerings, the restaurants, cafes that are more and more geared towards high-end clients. This process of gentrification has also been accompanied with greening, and the issue is who is accessing these spaces. It tends to be more high-income, wealthier classes and often we're seeing working classes being displaced through these projects. So for example, St. Henry is one of these neighborhoods. It's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in Canada. The Lachine Canal, when it opened in 1825, was a key transport axis that brought raw materials to the area, and the neighborhood was the place for working class populations that lived there and worked there, and it was very much associated with poverty and marginalization. This began to change in the 1990s when the Lachine Canal was remediated and rehabilitated. This is now turned into a 14-kilometer long bicycle and walking path. Along the edges, there's been a huge amount of new condo developments that's for more high-end residents. And in essence, the access to the canal and the use of the canal has been largely privatized. So a lot of working class long-term residents are not able to access the space, or they don't feel welcome in those spaces. So on top of popular planning proposals and proposals to intervene in social housing, there's a major issue in St. Henry with food deserts historically. And now this is changing, but the new food offerings are geared towards high-end residents that have incomes that are able to afford organic, healthy food. So there's been very active organizing against gentrification in St. Henry. For example, Solidarité Saint-Henri is a community organization that's existed for 35 years. It's a Table des Quartiers, it's a community board that brings together different associations in the neighborhood to fight against poverty and to find solutions.
So a strategy that we developed and put in place in the neighborhood to address inequality, so that very, very unequal access to food in the neighborhood, was to start our own community markets. What we've done in the past year and a half since the pandemic was actually make that project into a community food hub. So now there's a new organization that runs a food bank, that runs weekly markets to help address inequality and food insecurity in the neighborhood. Because that's the real heart of the story. Montreal is becoming a city where there are very rich people living right beside very poor people, and we need to address that. And right now, none of the political parties are talking about that need to address inequality in our city.
In contrast to these more top-down projects like the Lachine Canal, there are also green alleys, Ruelles Vertes, which are driven by the residents themselves. So here's where local residents come together and decide to turn the alleyway behind their house into a green space, and they receive support from the Écoquartier, which is a local environmental organization run by the borough, which is the City of Montreal. And of course, in this process, they build relationships between themselves and they build a stronger social fabric.
When I was working for Écoquartier, we'd really try to make sure that it's ground up, because that allows us to really include everyone and bring a diversity of residents to brainstorm together on what their needs are and what they want, because not everyone has the same needs. And that tends to create a project that maybe won't have as much luxurious turnout, because it's going to be created by and for collective people, and it's not, it takes a little bit longer to brainstorm, etc. But the result is that it's really owned by the community.
Another organization that's been important in the struggle against gentrification in Saint-Henri is POPIR, which is a housing rights committee that organizes to fight for the right to housing. POPIR has been active and important in showing how gentrification is happening in these parts of the neighborhood. They've been struggling for social housing and proposing new ways to use former industrial sites like the Lachine Canal, the Turcot interchange, to ensure it meets the needs of long-term residents.
Aussi, le POPIR, on fait partie d'un collectif qui s'appelle le collectif À nous le Malting. La Canada Malting est la dernière usine abandonnée, pas reconvertie en condo à Saint-Henri, et qu'on exige que ça soit racheté par la ville et donné à la communauté pour développer du logement social. On a un projet de musée industriel et de l'histoire de la classe ouvrière. Ça fait maintenant, je dirais, presque 10 ans qu'on est dans cette lutte-là. Mais nous, on dit toujours que notre vrai pouvoir, c'est dans la rue, c'est dans la mobilisation. Fait qu'on mène des occupations, on dérange des séances des conseils publics, on est tout le temps mobilisés. C'est parce qu'on n'a pas de choix. C'est un moment dans l'histoire de Saint-Henri où si ça avance beaucoup plus loin, la gentrification, ça serait plus du tout un quartier où les gens à faible revenu puissent se loger.
In the United States, we see green inequalities pushed to a whole other level, oftentimes because of the ways in which political campaigns and municipal budgets work in the US. There's a lot of dependence on taxes coming from redevelopment projects and real estate investments. And so at the end of the day, where we see greening inequalities most manifesting is in the construction of luxury housing for privileged residents in the vicinity or as part of greening itself. Those dynamics are well illustrated in the case of East Boston, an area of the city that has experienced massive greening and climate resilience work along its waterfront for the last decade or so.
East Boston is located just across the harbor from downtown Boston. It has a long-standing history of working-class residents, originally from Canadian backgrounds, then Irish backgrounds, later then to Russian Jewish, Eastern European Jewish to Italian, and now more recently Southeast Asian and Central and South American. The neighborhood has also a long-standing history of environmental injustices, specifically spurred by a lot of urban development in the 20th century, most notably being the Logan International Airport.
By 2019, Massport, the Massachusetts Port Authority, which is the agency that owns and operates Logan International Airport, had reported that Logan's air carriers and operations at the airport are producing over 35,000 pounds of EPA criteria pollutants every day. The folks at Massport also reported that the airport developed 810,000 metric tons of CO2, greenhouse gases. So what we've got since the beginning, where it was just a small airfield, to now where it's a major international airport, is a monstrosity which is polluting recklessly and without accountability.
The community also has a long backstory of grassroots activism in the area, specifically for the much needed green spaces that were removed through the airport expansion. That said, nowadays, this same green space is spurring a lot of the gentrification in the area, displacing many of the residents that fought hard for this green space.
The story of the Bremen Street Park is just awesome. This space used to be probably 20 railroad tracks connecting the waterfront to the Grand Trunk Railroad. When I was a young kid, this was just parking for the airport, extra airport parking. Just south of here in the East Boston Greenway was an abandoned place with cars dumped in it, weeds, homeless people living in it. And that extended all the way to the water to where you got fences with derelict waterfront space. And then as a result of the airport activists pushing and pushing, we started to see possibilities of developing open space. It's not just like compensation, it's giving people in the neighborhood something nice. At the same time, cities are becoming more and more popular. It's just a trend across the world. That's where economic advantage begins to take over the story. And suddenly, each parcel on the waterfront is springing up 200-unit buildings, $5,000 rents. They don't build these things for workforce housing. Everybody's only building what they call luxury condominiums. The parks that we've worked so hard for to improve the lives of the people who live here are not being enjoyed, therefore, necessarily by the people who can no longer live here, and they have to move out. And yeah, those parks are always on the pictures. You know, when they sell the luxury condo, they say it's just steps from the Greenway.
East Boston is also host to a large industrial area whose environmental consequences are mostly endured by the lower income and immigrant communities that live there. In this context, the newly built green-blue spaces, also built for their climate resilience, are adding to the tensions in the neighborhood. Specifically that traditional local residents do not feel welcome in these spaces, specifically that they feel excluded and that they're being pushed out because of them.
Porque esta es una historia que nos está golpeando fuertemente, pero no nos está beneficiando a nosotros, los residentes que hemos vivido por años dentro de esta comunidad. Eso es lo más increíble, ¿verdad? Yo siempre digo, yo no estoy en contra de los desarrollos, pero hay que ser equitativos, hay que mantener ese equilibrio de cómo manejar la vida de los residentes que han habitado y han construido comunidades por muchos años, porque estas comunidades, quiérase o no, aunque seamos inmigrantes, nosotros siempre pagamos esos impuestos, lo que significa que tenemos derecho a gozar de estas áreas verdes, tenemos derecho de gozar de estos parques, tenemos el derecho de disfrutar estas áreas de donde está el área costera. Todos estos son derechos que tenemos, pero en realidad sentimos que se están violando esos derechos. Esta roca que ustedes pueden ver ahí, dice la ciudad no es un accidente. Recuerdo que esta fue la primera roca que instalaron cuando empezaron los desalojos masivos y ellos dijeron, es que esta comunidad no se creó por accidente, esta comunidad se creó porque nosotros, los residentes, nosotros los inmigrantes que llegamos a esta comunidad, la construimos y por eso tenemos el mismo derecho de gozar de estos privilegios que la naturaleza tiene con nosotros.
In the midst of these harmful patterns of gentrification and displacement, often propelled by these newly built green, blue spaces from a very top-down development perspective, there are local communities that are finding ways to take ownership of their land. This is specifically the case for Eastie Farms that takes abandoned lots and builds community gardens and ultimately cultivating community belonging.
Eastie Farm came out of the realization that a lot of the immigrants in this neighborhood have agrarian backgrounds. They want to get their hands dirty. They want to plant something. They want to grow their own food. They want to bring their children and show what they used to do back home. Also, there are pieces of land that have been abandoned and not put to good use that could be turned into open, green community spaces where people can gather, get to know each other, build bridges across economic, cultural, linguistic backgrounds, and become a strong community. So growing food is this visceral, joyful thing that we can all do. However, it really is only a vehicle for growing communities, for growing good citizens, responsible citizens.
Washington, D.C. is a fascinating example of green inequalities because of the history of segregation and of land loss that African Americans have lived for decades, if not centuries. What we see in Washington, D.C. now is how a group of residents and community organizations are coming together to create urban greening that can reconcile residents on both sides of the Anacostia River. So it's really being proactive and preemptive about green gentrification, recognizing that it creates a form of speculative movement that starts as soon as a new green plan or project is being announced or revealed to the public.
Anacostia is the most disinvested of the neighborhoods in DC. It lies on the east side of the river, and it was initially settled by freed slaves. Since then, it's gone through iterations of being disinvested in numerous ways, most particularly through the process of racial redlining. In this context, Anacostia is now being targeted for several big development projects. One of those is the 11th Street Bridge project, which will provide, on the one hand, much needed green space for people living in the neighborhood. However, those who have been involved in designing the project from the beginning have foreseen that it has the possibility of creating greater inequities in the neighborhood. And so for this reason, they've tried to implement from the beginning a community involvement process known as an equitable development plan. Out of this process have come several big grassroots initiatives. One of those is the Douglas Community Land Trust, which aims to provide affordable housing and maintain the control of the land in the neighborhood for residents who've been there for generations.
Actually, the idea of doing a community land trust came out of several of those meetings because residents who live around here said, "What about us? Where are we going to go when real estate prices rise?" They came up with the name Douglas Community Land Trust to pay honor to Frederick Douglass, who lived here in the later parts of his life up in Anacostia neighborhood of DC on the east side of the Anacostia River. Douglas Community Land Trust's first rental property was the 65-unit Savannah Apartments building. Douglas Community Land Trust was able to invest $1.3 million in the property to reach the affordability levels that the developer and the residents wanted it to be. There is still an incredibly strong history here, a very proud history of families going back many generations. We have to pay attention to what the culture of the place is and try to do our best to maintain that sense of place for people so that it doesn't just become an anywhere USA.
Another big development project occurring in the neighborhood is the redevelopment of the area known as Berry Farm, which lies right next to the 11th Street Bridge and the Douglas Bridge. This area was historically a plantation that was later settled by formerly enslaved people. Then in the 1950s, it was turned into a public housing facility which housed around 400 families. The new development will include a mixed-use, mixed-income area, which will, on the one hand, include affordable units, although these affordable units are still out of reach of the majority of residents in the neighborhood. And this calls to question whether this new use of the land really meets the needs of the residents of Anacostia.
We're in Berry Farm's land development. This used to be property of free black military men who had families who were stationed over here in DC in the district. Over the time, a lot of the land had to be redeveloped because more income came in and more money being financed for this development to help reconstruct more housing, more opportunity, more work. So in order to do that, they had to tear it down and redevelopment and offer opportunity for other people.
People were talking about Berry Farm. People in the neighborhood were concerned about what was happening at Berry Farm. And when I appeared at the zoning hearing, I was appalled at what I saw. There were a lot of procedures that were ignored, a lot of legal malfeasance in that case, which is why we went to court and won the case. I don't think that the law is effective. You see, we won the case, but the site is empty and people are displaced. And I don't think very many people are better off for that victory. I mean, maybe in a spiritual sense or maybe some law, but in terms of like real people's lives, it's an abstraction. And so I don't think that the law is an answer to displacement. I think that the answer to displacement is more of, it resides within the people and the will of the people and the kinds of development and the paradigms for development that we would like to see.
In front of the developments happening in the neighborhood have arisen several grassroots efforts to really change the political and social understanding of what has happened and what is happening. One of these grassroots efforts is One DC, which is a group of people which is organized to educate the public about the political and social consequences of the past redlining practices and other racist planning policies, but also in understanding what the potential consequences of the new developments are and could be in the future.
So one of the things that is important about Anacostia and DC in general is that there's a lot of Black history and culture that's evident, and you can see it in everyday life. Most longtime Black DC residents will say Ward 8, where we are sitting, is the last frontier where hundreds of Black people could be massively removed and replaced by whiteness. Because as the 11th Street Bridge literally becomes the bridge for displacement, we want to organize people to fight for outright to stay. What we've noticed is that when it comes to racial and environmental justice, when things start to get cleaned up, we, the working class Black folks, start to get pushed out, right? And we want to consciously resist that, because there's been a lot of young Black people who have been part of the cleaning up of the river, right? There have been plenty of Black folks who have used the park, right, as a space for wellness, for exercise. So this community is a majority Black. Will the bridge add to that? And will the cleaning of the river add to that? Or will it take from that and make our job of organizing people to have the right to stay, the right to live, and the right to work in Anacostia a possibility? And we're saying that we're willing to fight for that. And we're saying that the Black Workers and Wellness Center will be the home to build that kind of power.
Portland is the end of our journey through the tensions and the contradictions of the Green City. It's one of the most so-called sustainable, livable cities in the US, not only because of the green infrastructure, but also the transit, the back lane. It's a very dynamic and young city. And at the same time, we have this neighborhood, a historically Latinx neighborhood called Cully, that many residents don't necessarily understand, or many community groups don't necessarily see as the incarnation of the Green City. Here, what we see is how residents can come together to address different environmental struggles, different needs at the same time. Some coming from climate resilience needs, other from the creation of broader access to green space, and also a whole green economy led and created by historically marginalized groups and community organizations. This is really one of the pathways towards urban green justice and greater equity in the Green City, in Portland and much beyond.
Cully is a neighborhood that became part of Portland in the 1980s. And for that reason, it has developed with a lack of services. It still has a low housing density, And the parks that have been built in the neighborhood have appeared quite recently. Also related with all these characteristics, the neighborhood has become much more affordable than other parts of Portland. And that means that has attracted people from all over the world, and also African-American communities and population that had been displaced from other neighborhoods of Portland. Gentrification is moving from west to east in Portland City. Then we can see already in the west side of the neighborhood that there are trendy restaurants, bakeries, cafeterias, and in the neighborhood there is fear of displacement of the traditional communities. At the same time, in the neighborhood, there are organizations trying to fight for the quality of life of the low-income residents and people of color. One clear example of this is livability, that is a coalition of 4 organizations that tries to ensure that residents maintain control over all the decisions that will impact their neighborhood.
These 4 organizations united in order to build grassroots political power for people to be able to stay in this community and really shape its future, rather than being subject to displacement as gentrification sweeps across the neighborhood. So at the end of a year-long campaign in 2016, we were successful in purchasing the Oakleaf Mobile Home Park to prevent it from being sold to an investor who was going to shut it down. Through a lot of partnerships, we were able to support the complete renovation of the Oakleaf Mobile Home Park, and all of the residents have completely new homes with stable rents. The park will never be sold and shut down. It is owned by a nonprofit affordable housing provider. Then, just immediately across the street here was a big building. It was originally built in the 1950s as a grocery store, but by the time we got to the 1990s, it became the Sugar Shack, a notorious adult entertainment complex. So it had been a long-time goal of people in this community, including the Living Cully organizations, to find a way to acquire that property, shut down what had been happening there, and do something positive with it. And that was successful in 2015 when Living Cully took ownership of that property. Hacienda CDC is now nearing completion, not only on 141 permanently affordable homes, but a community event and meeting space and a plaza courtyard for events and food carts.
A very special role in the coalition is played by Verde, an association that has helped residents of Portland and Cully to reconceptualize the idea of environmentalism into an anti-poverty and anti-displacement strategy, turning the implementation of environmental amenities into work opportunities for underprivileged neighborhood residents.
There is a pervasive narrative of Portland being a green and sustainable city where everyone rides bikes and goes to the farmer's market and composts, and there's this idea of this green utopia, but that is contradictory to the realities of the lived experiences of so many Portlanders. We've always been an extremely divided city. We have a lot of racial disparities here. Rapid gentrification and displacement has disproportionately impacted Black community members here and all other communities of color. That's the work that we've tasked ourselves with doing, is saying, no, all these sort of green investments that are happening are making other people wealthy. Wider, wealthier communities is where we're seeing those investments. We can do that ourselves in a different way, like Cully Park, for example, which we turned a 25-acre former quarry and then turned into a landfill. We did the advocacy, we did the work for fundraising, and then we actually built the park itself, creating jobs. I mean, that longevity of that vision of creating environmental wealth, a park, took so many years and so many hands, but the vision came from within our communities, and we acted upon that. Our approach has continued to be that we want to build these environmental assets, not for future residents, but we want to build it with current residents who are Cully community members for the benefit of Cully community members, as to not perpetuate this green divide that we see, which is wealthier, wider communities being able to essentially have these green enclaves in which they will be protected from the devastating impacts of a very uncertain future. We do not want that. that. You want to be in control and understand how to harness these resources and to ensure that this can be a driver for sustainability and for environmental wealth, and not just for gentrification, displacement, and the perpetuation of a green gap, or as we can say, a green divide.